The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. A pleasing land of drowsy head it is, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles in the sky that pass, forever flushing round the summer sky. Castle of Indolence. The bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, where they always prudently shortened sail and explored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed. There lies a small market town, or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and popularly known by the name of Tarrytown. And this name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country from the intrepid propensity of their husbands to linger about the village, tavern, on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land, among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of the quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks upon the uniform tranquillity. I recollect that when a stripling, my first exploit in the squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shade one side of the valley, and I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around, and it was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If I should wish for a retreat, whether I might steal it from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. The listless repose of the place and the particular character of its inhabitants were descendants from the original Dutch settlers. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the almost atmosphere, the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of this settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk into a continual reverie that are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country. And the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. Dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to be the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannibal in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of the night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, yes, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before day breaks. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows. And the spectre is known at all the country's firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the it is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by every one who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in this great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this byplace of nature, there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mine as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to this person. He was tall, but exceedingly lanky, Narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame, mostly most loosely hung together. For his head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long sniped nose that so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of the hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, he might have mistaken one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth or some scarecrow eloped from the cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partially patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a with withe twisted in the handle of the door, and sticks set against the window shutters, so that though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he could find some embarrassment in getting out, an idea most probably borrowed by the architect Jost von Houten from the mystery of an Elepot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and the formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, coning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by by the authoritative voice of the master in the tone of menace or command, or pre-adventure, by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiter along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and even bore in mind the golden maximum: spare the rod, and spoil the child. Igbot's Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny striplings that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by an indulgence. The claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion of some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin, who sulked and swelled, and grew dodged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance, so consolatory to the smarting urchin, that he would rather it and thank him for the long day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the large boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home who happened to their pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils, The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, he had the undilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successfully a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in the cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too onerous on the peruse of his rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmasters a mere drones. He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mending the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood from the winter fire. He laid aside drove cows from the pasture and cut wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway from which he lorded it in his little empire, school, and became wonderfully gentle and integrating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bulls, which Whilom, Whilom so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with a child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him, on Sundays, to take his station in front of the church gallery, with a band of chosen singers, where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above all the rest of the congregation, and there are particular quavers still to be heard in that church, and which may even be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond, on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from that nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, my driver's little makeshifts in that ingenious way which was commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work to have a wonderfully easy life at it. Schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of the rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parsons. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea table of a farmhouse, of the addition of supernumerary dish of cakes and sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of silver tea pot. Our man of letters, therefore, was particularly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he could how he would figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overrun the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all their epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. From his half itinerant life, also, he was kind of traveling a traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was moreover esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he would most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple cruelty. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his captious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clovers bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales until the gathering dusk of the evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended on his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature that witching owl fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of whip-poor-will. The whip-poor-will is a bird which is only heard at night. It receives its name from its note, which is thought to resemble those words. From the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad, that harboring of storm, the dreary hooting and of the screeching owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path, and if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource on such occasions, either to drown thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors on the evening, were often filled with awe by hearing his nasal melody, and linked sweetness, long drawn out, floating from the distant hills or along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by fire, with the row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the hollows, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft, and of the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds of the air, which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all this while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all the ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dare to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of the snowy night? With what wistful look did be eye every ever trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window? How often he was appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder, lest he should behold some uncouth being trampling close behind him. And how often he was thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among in the trees, the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scorings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walked in darkness. And though he seen many spectres in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan and divers shapes and his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life on it. In despite of these of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled on an evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornament of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Sardin, the tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal the provokingly short petticoat, to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft, foolish heart towards the sex, and it's not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favour in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltrus van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piked himself upon the haughty abundance, rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water, in a little well, formed of a barrel, and then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighboring brook that bubbled along among alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church. Every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The flail was busily resounding within it from morning to night. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves. The rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about in their dams, were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in the repose, the abundance of their pens, whence sailed forth now and then troops of sucking pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stately squadron of snow geese were riding in the adjoining pond, conveying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and the guinea fowls fretting about it like ill-tempered housewives with a peevish, discontent cry. Before the bar door strutted the gallant cock, pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clasping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride and gladness of his heart. Sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling his ever hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. Pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes, like snug married couples, with a decent contin- consistency of onion sauce. In the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham. Not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up, with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savoury sausages, and even bright Chancelier himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish, with uplifted claws, as if carving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, and the rich fields of wheat and of rye, of buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingled palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children, mounted on the top of the wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he beheld himself striding a pace mare of a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house of the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high, rigid, but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. Low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches being along were, were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which form which formed the centre of the mansion and the place of usual residence. Here, rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey woolsey, just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples, and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the god of red peppers. And the door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors, and Drians, with their accompanying shovel and tongs, glistened from their covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and the corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From that moment, Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight. The peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass and walls of adamant to the castle keep, where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved so easily as a man would carve his way into the centre of the Christmas pie. And then the lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments, and he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, and numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out of the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade by the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short curly black hair and a bluff, but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for the great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being the dexterous on being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy which bodily strength acquires in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decision with an air and tone admitting of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition. Hmm. His composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dish of waggish good humor at bottom. He had three or four boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles round. In cold weather he was distinguished by a fur cap, surmounted with flaunting fox's tail. And when the folks at the country gathering descried this well-known crest at a distance, whisking about among a squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight with whoop and hollow, like the troop of Don Cossacks and the old dams, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry scurry of the clattering by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe and admiration and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. The Rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and, though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it was, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire who felt no inclination to cross a line of his amours, and so much that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or, as it was termed, sparkling within. All other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war to other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things, a astuter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form a spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk, he was as erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours. any more than a stormy lover, Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gentle, insinuating manner, under cover of his character of singing master. He made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Bolt van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter even better even than his pipe, and, like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife too, and had enough to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house, or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Bolt would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior who, armed with a sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along the twilight, that hour was so favourable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have one vulnerable point, or door of access, while others have a thousand avenues, and may be captured in a thousand different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter. For the man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins a thousand common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brombones, and from that moment Ichabod Crane made his advances. The interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare, and have settled their pres- pretensions to the lady according to the mode those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious in the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard the boast of Bones, that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on the shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in the obstinately pacific system. It left Brom with no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried to they harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, and broke into the schoolhouse at night in spite of its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think of the witches in the country held in their meetings there. But what But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and they introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. This way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on a lofty stool whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literacy realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, that sceptre of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on three nails behind the throne, in constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles of prohibited weapons detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as unmunched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his school scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering from them, with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. He was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a negro in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round crow fragment of a hat like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by the way of halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry making of, or quilting frolic, to be held that evening at Mynheer van Tassel's, and, having delivered his message with that air of importance and effort of fine language which negroes aptly to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook, and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance of a hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelling and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only, suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer, with whom he was domin, domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman by the name of Hans van Ripper, and thus, gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight errant in his quest of adventures, but is met I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account by of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestowed was broken down plough horse, that had outlived most everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with an ewe neck, and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring in spectacle, but the other was had the gleaming of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name of he bore of gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favourite steed of his master's, Cloric van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused very probably some of his own spirit into the animal, for, old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with a short stirrup, which brought his knees merely up to the pommel of the saddle, with sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a sceptre, and his horse jogged on the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttering out almost to his horse's tail. With such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as it is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I had said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene. Nature wore that rich golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into a brilliant dye of orange and orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry they fluttered, chirping and frolicking, from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious of the very profuse and variety around them. There was the honest cock robin, the favourite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds, flying the sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker, and with his crimson crest, his broad black gorget, and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird, with its red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail, and its little Montero cap with feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb, of his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, bobbing and nodding and bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songster of the grove. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cedar press. Further on the beheld great fields of Indian corn, with golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, yellow pumpkins laying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive. And as he beheld with them, soft anticipations stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey or trickled by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of ranged hills, which look upon some of the goodliest scenes of that mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down into the west. The wide bosom of the Tepanzee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation wave and prolong the blue shadow of the distant mountain, and a few amber clouds floating in the sky, without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine gold tint, changing gradually into the pure green apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipice that hung over some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. The slope was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast, and as the reflection of the sky gleamed down the still water, as it seemed as if the vessel was suspended in the air. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Herr von Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare leathern face race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles, their brisk withered littered dams, in close crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats, with scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside, buxom lashes, almost as antiquated as their mothers, expecting, excepting wear a straw hat, a fine riband, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms in city invocation. The sons, in short square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and the hair generally queued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eel skin for the purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country as a potent nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and with no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a trackable, well broken horse as unworthy as of a lad of spirit. Fain I would pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero, as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion, not those of the bevy of buxom lashes, with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of the genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn, such heaped up platter of cakes and various and almost indescribable kinds known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tender oil cake, the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, honey cakes, and whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies, peach pies, and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham, smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, and mingled higgledy pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and I am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in such a great hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart, dilated in the proportions of his skin, was filled with good cheer, and whose spirit rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers, and in the face of Hans van Ripper and every other niggardly patron, and kick an internet pedagogue out of the doors that should dare to call him comrade. Old Baltrus van Tassel moved about among his guests, with a face dilated with the content and good humor, brown and jolly as a harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief, but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room, or hall, summoned to the dance. Musicians the musician was an old grey-headed negro, who had been the internet orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. A great part of the time he scraped on two or three strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head bowing almost to the ground, the stamping of his foot whenever the fresh couple were to start. Ichabod prided himself upon the dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fibre about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought Saint Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the negroes, who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm and the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling with their white eyeballs, and showing grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, smiling graciously in all reply to his amorous oglings, while Brombones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. The dance was at an end. Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the Sagar folks, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had therefore been the scene of marauding, and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction. and in the indistinctness of his recollection to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dofu Martling, a large, blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastworker, only that his gun burst in the sixth discharge, and there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich miner to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defence, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bent. There were several more of that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but the persuading that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales of superstition thrive best in these sheltered, long settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in the grave, the graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom heard of ghosts except in our long established Dutch communities. The immediate causes, however, the prevalence of the supernatural stories in the past in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of the Sleepy Hollow. There was connotation in the very air that blew from the haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several Sleepy Hollow people were present at the Van Tassels, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains, and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen of Ravenlock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief parts of the story, however, turned upon the favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the headless horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seemed always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shone modestly forth, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water broadened by high trees, between which peeps may caught at the night hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yards, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there at least the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep dark, over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favourite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told by of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the tree tops with a clasp of thunder. The story was immediately matched by a thrice marvellous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Harrison as an errant jockey. He affirmed that, on returning one night from the neighbouring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all a hollow. Just as they came into the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales told in the drowsy undertone with which men talked in the countenance of the listeners only now and then receiving the casual gleam from the glare of the pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invulnerable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in the nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The reveal now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families in their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on the pillions behind their favourite swains, and their light-hearted laughter mingling with the clatter of hoofs echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the customs of the country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sailed forth, after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and chop-fallen. Oh, these women! Could that girl have been played off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roast, rather than a fair lady's heart, without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of ruled wealth on which he had so often gloated, and he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travel homewards, along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarry Town, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself, Far below him, the Tappanzee spread its dusk and indistinct waste of waters, he, with here and there the tall mast of sloping riding quietly at anchor under the land. And the dead hush of midnight he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. But it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from his faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off, from some far, so- from some farmhouse away among the hills. But it was like a dreaming sound in his ears. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of the bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding on his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was moreover approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree which towered like a giant above all the other trees in the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with a tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of the sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partially for the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan,